Thank you for being here. This webinar, The Difficulty of Being Just, including people with disabilities and congregational life, is being sponsored by the Pacific Western region of the UUA, and thanks to Lori Ragona for setting this up and for hosting tonight. I'm Mark Bernstein. I'm the Regional Growth Development Consultant with the Central East Regional Group. I'm also the UUA liaison to equal access and to issues in disability and accessibility at the UUA. So thank you for being here. Let me start by lighting the chalice and reading these opening words. Our faith calls us to live a spirit of radical hospitality. Only when we are truly open to the wealth of diversity in our world will the inherent worth and dignity of every person be affirmed with a large voice. Let's not rest until all are welcomed into beloved community. And these words actually come from the official Welcoming Congregation program, the program that welcomes people of LGBTQ into our congregational life. But for many people who have documented disabilities, it's been difficult for them to enter into congregational life. I read many stories from people with disabilities who tell of barriers to full inclusion. And let me just share an excerpt from one of those stories. This person writes, "The sanctuary is up a full flight of stairs, and many social events are held down a full flight of stairs. Attending religious education can involve several flights of stairs. We've seen folks leave, including a past president whose sister required accommodations. They did make an effort to create a, quote, second sanctuary on the first floor with a video feed, but it was hard to change the culture of people feeling free to walk through, making noise, preparing for coffee hour, and so on. A formal request for the worship service to be occasionally held on the first floor so everyone could worship together was never granted by the worship committee." This is just a sampling of the kinds of stories that we hear from people who are sometimes literally locked out of congregational life. So Victor Hugo wrote, "Being good is easy. What is difficult is being just." At Emory University, researchers Sarah Brosnan and Franz de Waal conducted a fascinating experiment on this sense of fairness. They taught monkeys to swap tokens for food. Initially, the reward was a piece of cucumber, a food that these monkeys would work for even though they're not crazy about cucumbers. I mean, who really is? But when the researchers started rewarding some of the monkeys with grapes instead of cucumbers, a food that monkeys much prefer, the latter group, the group that continued to work for cucumbers, took offense. In some cases, they refused to comply with the task. They stopped doing it. In other cases, they took the food but refused to eat it. And in some cases, they actually threw the cucumber at the researcher. And if you want to see this for yourself, it is on YouTube. If you key in words like Emory University, fairness, monkey experiment, any of those words will bring up a few different variations of this video. It's really worth watching. So scientists say that this research suggests that human sense of justice is inherited and is not a social construct. The experiment with the monkeys demonstrates our natural reaction to become angry or frustrated when we are treated differently from others, or when we see others obtain or achieve things that we aspire to obtain or achieve as well. Being in right relationship with people who have documented disabilities is more than etiquette. It is more than being polite. It requires that we treat others equally and fairly, that we work as hard as we can to ensure that everyone has the same opportunities, the the same resources, and the same rewards. It stems from the basic belief that if I am eating grapes, then all those around me should be eating grapes as well. The National Organization on Disability wrote that people with disabilities are very likely to say their faith is important to them, but are more likely to not attend services due to accessibility issues. With the aging of the American population, they continue. The situation is becoming an increasingly significant factor in worship community vitality. The National Organization on Disability sponsored a survey that was done by the Kessler Foundation. It was a survey of Americans with disabilities that was conducted in July of 2010. And these were some of the findings. About 65% of all U.S. residents, both those with and without disabilities, say their religious faith is very important. A surprising statistic. And I don't want to get into spiritual versus religious tonight. But people with very severe disabilities are more likely to say their religious faith is very important to them than people with slight disabilities. And those percentages were 73% people with severe disabilities, very severe, versus 55% people with slight disabilities. So in this study, the greater the level of disability, the more important the religious faith was to those people in the survey. People with disabilities, the survey found out further, are less likely than people without disabilities to attend religious services on a regular basis. What they found was that 50% of people with disabilities state that they attend religious services at least once per month. However, 57% of people without disabilities do the same. So there was a gap of 7 percentage points. And interestingly, this gap between people with and without disabilities in terms of attendance at religious services is almost identical to what they found when they did this survey in 2004. So over the last 9 years, there has not been a closing of the gap between people with and without disabilities in terms of their attendance in religious services. So I think that this issue that we're addressing tonight is a moral issue, among other things. And here are some positions or quotes from various denominations. Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote, "Religion offers community to our lonely human souls. The house of worship represents one place where the barriers fall and we all stand equal before God." The Prophet Muhammad wrote, "Allah does not judge according to your bodies and appearances, but he scans your hearts and looks into your deeds." A statement of the U.S. Catholic bishops on persons with disabilities goes as follows. "When we think of persons with disabilities in relation to ministries, we tend automatically to think of doing something for them. We do not reflect that they can do something for us and with us. They have the same duty as all members of the community to do the Lord's work in the world according to their God-given talents and capacities." And the United Church of Christ says, "Jesus did not turn people away, neither do we." And thank you for that comment, Deanna, who noted that she just posted an article about a mother looking for a place to worship with her son with a disability. I think we're seeing more and more of those as people with disabilities become more empowered to take part in mainstream life. There's a corresponding increase in the desire to be part of a religious community as well. I think that this issue is also a justice issue. People with disabilities experience inequalities. For example, when they are denied equal access to health care, employment, education, or political participation because of their disability. They're subject to violations of dignity, for example, when they are subjected to violence, abuse, prejudice, or disrespect because of their disability. And some people with disabilities are denied autonomy, for example, when they are subjected to involuntary sterilization, or when they are confined in institutions against their will, and yes, institutions still do exist, or when they are regarded as legally incompetent because of their disability. And this issue is also a growth issue. If people with disabilities are denied access to our religious communities, it impacts on our numerical growth and our organic growth, with fewer talented and committed people to share in the work of the congregation. For current members of our congregations who, as they age, develop disabilities, our unwillingness or inability to accommodate them may force them to leave, and we are all diminished as a result. In other words, it contributes to leaving the back door wide open. So, on both moral and justice grounds, and as a tool for congregational growth, is this the new frontier for Unitarian Universalism? Is this the next marginalized group that gets the attention of the UUA and its congregations? I hope so, and that's something that we and Lisa and Equal Access are working very hard to do. So, who are we talking about in this webinar? We're talking about people with visual, auditory and mobility limitations, chemical sensitivities. There are also people, obviously, with cognitive and psychiatric disabilities. For our purposes tonight, however, the focus will be on people with physical disabilities, visual, auditory, mobility, and chemical disabilities. So what I'd like to do is to review some of the perceived barriers to access for people with disabilities and offer some clarification or some fact that might counter some of the prevailing feelings or myths that surround this issue. The first barrier is that religious institutions are exempt from the Americans with Disabilities Act and therefore do not have to make physical accommodations. The fact is that while religious institutions are exempt under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, they are not exempt under Title I, employment. So congregations that employ 15 or more staff, and I know that not a large percentage of our congregations, but some of our larger congregations do have at least 15 staff. They need to make modifications to a building, a religious building, in order to accommodate an employee with a disability, even though they do not have to modify the building to accommodate other members of the public. Isn't that interesting? In addition, religious institutions receiving federal funds, if there are any out there, are not exempt under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and must make accommodations to any member that requires it. Another barrier is it costs too much money to make physical changes to the building or its contents. But the fact of the matter is, while it may be cost prohibitive to make large structural changes, and we certainly understand that, most accommodations require little or no outlay of money. A study that was done several years ago found that in organizations, the average cost to physically accommodate an individual was $500. The biggest investment really is not in money, but in the effort to find creative ways of enhancing the congregational experience. And I fear that some congregations don't even pursue that because they think that the price tag is too high, So there really isn't anything that we can do to accommodate people with, in this case, physical disabilities. Another barrier, since we can't make large physical changes to the building or its contents, there is little we can do to make people with disabilities feel welcome. Well, obviously, that's not something that anyone is going to condone. Instead, being aware of the needs of people with disabilities and addressing those needs with respect and compassion is often more important to the individual with a disability than implementing physical changes. Many people, most people, will respond more to the attitude of the congregation than to its ability to make physical changes that might cause undue hardship. So let me offer some suggestions on how congregations can be more accommodating to people with visual, auditory, and mobility limitations. Here are some suggestions. Cutouts in pews for wheelchairs, power-assisted doors, assisted listening devices, and even further, the installation of loop systems, which is a permanent listening device. Large print hymnals and orders of service, and the UUA bookstore sells large print hymnals. Ramps, lifts or elevators, accessible bathrooms, and accessible parking spots, and make sure you have enough of them. In the upper left-hand corner, you see a picture from the UU congregation in Center County, which is in State College, Pennsylvania, and they have several of these mats interspersed throughout the sanctuary. It's kind of hard to see from this picture, but the space is large enough to accommodate wheelchairs. And what's cool about it is they're not in the back, they're not in the front, they're interspersed throughout the seating in the sanctuary. What else should we be doing? Always use microphones, even if someone says they don't need one. How many times have you been in a meeting and you offered a microphone to someone and they said, I don't need a microphone, I've got a really loud voice? Well, you may, but that still may not mean that people will be able to hear you. It is just considerate to use a microphone. When I do a training session now or facilitate a gathering, I always use a microphone. Or if I don't, I ask people if there's anyone who at any time can't hear me or anyone else to please raise your hand and let us know. And I always encourage people to use their outdoor voices. But a microphone guarantees that people will hear. And people that are on the webinar with me are agreeing with me. Assisted listening devices only work with microphones. Good point, Lisa. Other things that we should be doing: encourage speakers, worship associates, anyone who speaks from the pulpit to speak loudly and clearly, even with a microphone. I frankly don't hear that well. So even if someone is standing behind the microphone and they don't speak up, I still can't hear it. Many people get behind a microphone and lower their voice because they think they'll be too loud. People also have a tendency to drop the volume of their voice when they get to the end of the sentence, so people can't hear the last few words. So we need to encourage, train, and remind speakers in our congregations to speak loudly and clearly until they get to the period at the end of the sentence. Raise the pulpit so that everyone can see the speaker. And make sure there is accessibility to the pulpit so that people with mobility limitations can speak or lead the service. It's not enough to have someone come up to the ground level and speak from there and not be able to go up on the stage and speak. And speaking of seats, it's not okay to force people who use wheelchairs to sit in front of all the pews or behind all the pews because there's no other seating option. segregated seating is not an acceptable seating arrangement. And my friends at the congregation in Center County have demonstrated that. Some sanctuaries have movable or interlocking or folding chairs. And sometimes these chairs are too narrow to be comfortable for people who are very large. So it's welcoming to offer some chairs that are wider and or more substantial for people who need them. And also some people have difficulty getting up from a chair that doesn't have arms. So it's welcoming to offer some chairs with arms for people who have knee, hip, or leg problems. And this can be pointed out during announcements that it would be welcoming for people to save these chairs for those who need them. And then finally, have seating space so there is extra leg room for people using crutches, braces, walkers, wearing casts, etc. What else can we be doing? Well, how about having a wheelchair or two donated and making them available in case someone with a stamina problem or someone who's feeling weak can use them? I also encourage congregations to make sure their members wear name tags all the time for people who have memory problems. It's important that we remember to leave seats on the aisles for people who may have difficulty moving into the aisles. And we can record services and make them available. Often a CD can be created instantaneously if you have the equipment, or have them available on your website as podcasts, or hand out printed versions of the sermon for people with hearing difficulties who may have missed some of it. Those are some of my suggestions for people with physical disabilities. Let me talk to you about people with environmental disabilities. Start with chemical sensitivities. So the buzzword is multiple chemical sensitivity, MCS. The symptoms can be debilitating, sometimes life-threatening, and they commonly include severe dizziness, headaches, fainting, tiredness, burning or itching of the skin and eyes, flu-like symptoms, emotional disturbances, and seizure disorders. Commonplace exposures that trigger symptoms for someone with these sensitivities include chemical emissions from new carpets, building materials and furnishings, scented personal care products, maintenance, cleaning, disinfection, and pest control chemicals, solvents, dyes, the list goes on, soft plastics, molds and mildew, animal dander, scented or petroleum candles, soaps, shampoos, detergents, wood and tobacco smoke, gas stove and furnace fuel and emissions, vehicle exhaust. These are the invisible disabilities, and studies have shown that as many as 15% of the population has some reaction to these chemicals. 15%. And then there's also electrical sensitivity, which produces symptoms in the individual exposed to common levels of electromagnetic fields from electrical sources in the environment, like power lines, motors, computers, transformers, cell phones, and so on. It can cause skin itch, rash, flushing, burning, and or tingling, confusion, poor concentration, and or memory loss, fatigue or weakness, headache, and chest pain, heart problems. These are the electrical sensitivities. The first I spoke of was the MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity. So what can we do to be sensitive to people with these invisible disabilities, with these chemical and electrical sensitivities? Here are some suggestions. Prohibit vehicles from standing for periods of time with their motors running near the building. In my congregation, the UU Church of Delaware County in Media, Pennsylvania, we share the building with a daycare center, and there is a sign outside where people tend to pull up in front, asking people to cut their engines and not idle. Other suggestions: use unscented beeswax candles. Keep the property near buildings free of herbicides and pesticides, or post notices before and after treatment. Ensure that at least one restroom is free of air fresheners or deodorizers and scented soaps. Have a designated fragrance-free area in a well-ventilated area of the sanctuary, and make sure that the area is wheelchair accessible. And consider soap flowers or organic flowers as an alternative to flowers treated with pesticides. Some of these changes could be traumatic to many members of the congregation, but we do it lovingly because we want to make sure that everyone has equal access. According to the Environmental Health Coalition of Western Massachusetts, 1 in 5 people experience health problems when exposed to fragrances. 1 in 5. And 72% of people with asthma have adverse reactions to perfume. In addition, the Fragrance Product Information Network reports that 17 million people have asthma, 35 million have chronic sinus problems, 25 million have migraines, and 1 to 2% of the population have skin allergies. All of these conditions can be exacerbated or at least negatively affected by fragrances. So we're talking about things that can affect a great many people. A few other things that we can do for people with chemical sensitivities. Inform the caring committee in your congregations of the special needs of people who have environmental sensitivities. So we need to ask the question. Have maintenance staff and others become familiar with less toxic cleaning products and use them whenever possible. Make sure the building is adequately ventilated and aired out periodically. Remove mold and mildew from the building, and I'm sure that many of our older buildings have mold and mildew throughout. And give advance notice when chemicals such as floor wax and pesticides are to be used within the building. Those are some of my suggestions for people with chemical sensitivities. Regardless of the nature of the disability, though, we need to be creating a welcoming environment for people who come through our doors. So greeters need to greet everyone. They also need to understand respectful protocol. If a person is using a wheelchair, for example, the greeter should ask if the person needs assistance and not automatically offer it. And they should wait until the person accepts their offer, if they do. We also need to train greeters and ushers so that they know where available resources are and how to use them, including the lift or elevator if you have it, or the assisted listening devices if you have them. When new members join, we should ask in a sensitive and dignified way if there are any accommodations that need to be made that would enhance their participation in the faith community. We obviously can't ask someone if they have a disability unless it's clearly an overt disability, like someone, for example, in a wheelchair. But we can ask people if there are any accommodations or ways that we can assist them that would enhance their participation. And we need to watch our language. There are still congregations that ask members to stand instead of asking them to rise in body or in spirit. And I think that we need to make that language absolutely mandatory. Congregational polity be damned. Congregations should be using that language. To ask a congregation to stand or stand as you are able is insulting to those people who are not able to stand or who could only stand for short periods of time. A couple of years ago, I went to a district assembly and that was hosted by one of the congregations in this district. And as we walked in, the congregation was standing, singing a hymn. They then proceeded to sing 2 more hymns, expecting the congregation to stand. So at the time we walked in and I started timing it, probably we were standing for at least 10 minutes before the hymns ended and we were asked to be seated. I was getting tired, and I was standing next to a person who I know has physical limitations, and asked her how she was doing, and she wasn't doing well. Of course, we're all invited to sit whenever we need to, but it wasn't the norm. It wasn't the expectation in this congregation. So congregations also need to be sensitive about asking members of the congregation to stand for too long periods of time. I'd like to offer a few words about including children with special needs in our classrooms and worship. I believe that we have a responsibility to make whatever accommodations we can to welcome children with special needs into congregational life. The communication with parents is essential to understand the needs of the child and to learn ways to support the child, particularly if the child exhibits negative behavior that could be potentially disruptive. We may require physical presence by the parents in the beginning until the child becomes acclimated, or the teachers or caregivers understand the child better. And I don't think that's asking too much. And in worship service, having children dance or move around, and I'm thinking of children who may have autism and engage in rhythmic behavior or become excited when the music is being sung or being played. So their dancing or moving around during a service is an acceptable way to worship. We also need to provide space for children with special needs to do this or to be in a space where they can be safe. And we need to be thankful for a congregation that embraces these children and everyone else. So where do you begin? My recommendation is to begin by forming a disability awareness task force and make sure that you include people with disabilities on it. It should be a mix of people with and without documented disabilities. And conduct an accessibility audit. You can contact me or you can contact Equal Access, and you have that resource to get more information on the various accessibility audits that are available. And we need to implement changes one step at a time and make sure that we're getting the congregation behind us every step of the way. This is the list of resources that it's not an exhaustive list, but a list of resources that are available, and they also are included on the notes page. And I'm going to pause for a few moments and invite those on the call to share any questions or comments via the chat box. We'll take a few moments to do that. Deanna is saying she's interested in learning more about the term documented disability. Yeah, I kind of, I don't know, Lisa, how you feel about this, but I've started using that. A documented disability is one where the person has a disability that causes disturbances or interruptions in various areas of a person's life, as opposed to someone who has a temporary ailment, someone who, for example, twisted their ankle or broke their foot. While they might need accommodations from us, I don't consider that to be a disability in the same vein that we're talking about in this webinar. And I hesitate to use the term permanent disability because that sounds somehow hopeless. So I use the term documented. That works for you, Deanna? Okay, good. Any other comments or questions before we move to the last part of the presentation? So let me share with you. Oh, Lisa, my feeling is that disability is part of the human condition. We all need accommodation sometimes. Can't argue with that. Well, and it doesn't matter if it's documented. Yeah, and maybe the word document is a little bit of a misnomer. I don't mean that it needs to be part of someone's plan, and maybe that's how it comes across. But I'm talking about a disability that is severe enough to impact on the quality of a person's life, and not a temporary ailment. I've heard people say, well, yeah, I wear glasses, so I have a disability. Why don't I have any rights? And it's that kind of comparison that kind of irks me, because it's not the same thing. So so Lisa, I get that you don't want people coming out of the woodwork to ask for accommodations too, so there has to be a line drawn somewhere. Yeah, absolutely. So let me share with you a short story in closing. In his book, Year of Our Lord, Faith, Hope, and Harmony in the Mississippi Delta, T.R. Pearson tells the story of Lucas McCarty, a young white man born with severe cerebral palsy who used a wheelchair but also got around by walking on his knees with the help of knee pads worn over his blue jeans. Lucas shouts and makes vocal sounds, but for the most part, communicates through an electronic language device. Lucas became a member of the Trinity House of Prayer, a small, poor African-American congregation. He was embraced by the congregation and was in no way considered out of place or disruptive. Lucas even joined the choir. So in his book, Pearson writes, and I quote, "Without exception, Trinity's members treated Lucas with unstudied compassion. At no financial cost to the congregation, no special programs, no architectural alterations, they demonstrated that making people with disabilities, even severe disabilities, feel a part of them is within reach of every house of worship. Sometimes," he concludes, "it's not about building a ramp. Sometimes it really is about opening up your heart." So let me turn off blow out the candle virtually and end with these closing words. Love me without restriction. Trust me without fear. Want me without demand. And accept me for who I am. Thanks very much for being with me.